So today I'm going to be talking about how to tell if you're neurodivergent or neurotypical. This was a special request and I wanted to speak about it. So to get started, let me just say that I am not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Think of me as some random lady in Dallas, Texas who is passionate about spreading autism awareness and also is passionate about neuroscience, among other things. And so take everything I say with a grain of salt, and please do not use anything in this podcast as a form of diagnostic criteria. Always look to professionals for a diagnosis like this, and don't just rely on what people online tell you. So anyways, to get started, how to know if you're neurodivergent versus neurotypical. So, if anyone in your life has ever told you to make eye contact or told you that it's something important that you should do, more likely that you're neurodivergent from that. Because neurotypicals are born with this default social framework that already includes eye contact. So if you shy away from eye contact, or if you make too much eye contact, or you make not enough eye contact, or the eye contact that you make when you're socializing with other people is deeply inconsistent or varies quite a bit, more likely you're neurodivergent based on that. There are many other signs as well. If you feel like you have to move constantly, movements of any kind, not big movements necessarily, but even small movements, any kind of stimming. If you feel like you have to do this or you start feeling uncomfortable or anxious, then you're probably neurodivergent. If when you say statements together, you don't necessarily connect them, then you're probably neurodivergent. One thing that neurotypicals frequently do is they will assume that there's a link between two statements that are spoken one after another. And this link is pretty much always assumed with neurotypicals, and with neurodivergence, we don't often assume the link. So if you are a very direct communicator, you might be neurodivergent. Directness is not a guaranteed part of the neurodivergent experience, but if you feel like your only framework for communication is to be direct, and you've really never understood any type of passive aggression or something like that without it being explained to you beforehand, then you might be neurodivergent. Other criteria: if you were really socially isolated from making a lot of mistakes with the way that you socialized and the way that you tried to connect with people in childhood, you might be neurodivergent. This is not necessarily a defining characteristic, but it's very common in the neurodivergent community, because when you're part of a 5% of people who communicates in a direct way, and the other 95% of people are making metaphors and stuff like that, it can sometimes be an isolating experience. I'll tell you all about some of the signs that I had in childhood. So I would constantly rock back and forth. This is a sign of vestibular stimming. I would do the hand flap when I was very, very young. So young, I actually have no memories of it. The only reason I know that I did it at all is because of videos that my parents filmed in my childhood. There are a few. What I mean by hand flap is basically where you use your wrist as a lever and you move your wrist back and forth in order to gain stimulation from it. I actually have a theory about that one. I think that joint issues and slight hyperextensibility of joints is linked to autism, so I think that's why some of these maybe odd-looking stims, like joints, stuff like that, are part of the autistic experience because of that hyperflexibility. If you feel like you always have to be fidgeting with something in your hands, you might be neurodivergent. If you have never understood why people want to desperately so fit in against all odds or against anything else, you might be neurodivergent. So most neurotypical people will prioritize the social norm above their own values, above everything else. If there's something that they don't necessarily agree with, but the social norm does, they'll go with the social norm almost every single time. Of course, there are some exceptions, and culture makes a huge difference in this. For example, German culture tends to be very direct and tends to be more self-focused and less based on social norms, which is something I've always really appreciated about German people. But even though culture plays a role, it's not exclusively that different. There's going to be differences across different cultures, but there's still a lot in common just from the experience of being neurotypical across cultures or being neurodivergent across cultures. And so you might be neurodivergent if you have to pick and choose which clothing to wear based on how it feels on your skin. You might be neurodivergent if you have trouble processing what people say to you. So if you say what a lot, someone says something to you and you say, what was that? And then 2 seconds later, before they even repeat it, you are able to process the information. That is a auditory processing issue, which is very common in neurodivergence. And you might be neurodivergent if you focus on the details first. So when a neurodivergent person looks at something, they see like a small circle of whatever their eyes are focused on. So if I say, look at that dress, well, I see the bow of the dress, I see the hem of the dress, I see the collar of the dress, I see the fabric of the dress, I see the specific colors used for the dress, and I see like the little tiny little pieces of fabric that most people would never notice. Maybe there's one that's slightly hanging off the side of the dress, and that's something neurotypicals typically wouldn't see. What do neurotypicals see? They see the dress. They see the entire dress. They don't think much of it. Likewise, if you are looking at a brick wall, this is a good example. If you're looking at a brick wall, what do you see? Neurotypicals will look at it and they'll see the entire brick wall, almost like in a square frame. I'm doing my best to describe it because I'm not neurotypical and I'm basing this off of my interactions with other people. So if this doesn't sound accurate and you're listening to this and you're neurotypical, please feel free to correct me. But the point of this is, if you're really great at seeing the big picture, you're probably not neurodivergent. If you're really great at seeing details and adept at pattern recognition, you're probably neurodivergent. If you would compromise your values just to be agreeable and fit in with a social community, you're probably not neurodivergent. If you stand by your values regardless of the external circumstances and are consistent, you're more likely to be neurodivergent. Not all of these are mutually exclusive, of course. There are exceptions to every rule, but these are some generalizations that I've observed. If from growing up you inherently understood the meaning of metaphors and the meaning of sarcasm, the meaning of jokes, wordplay, stuff like that, inherently without it being explained to you, then you're probably neurotypical. If not, you're probably neurodivergent. I'll give you an example. I think the reason I was undiagnosed for so long was because I grew up with my grandpa always making jokes. I mean, literally from birth. He would make jokes probably every hour. And as a kid, I would constantly ask him, what does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? And he would explain all of it. And that his explanations honestly got me through life in so many ways. And they still kind of do, to be honest. His explanations and his willingness to let me be who I am, and his willingness to teach me what I didn't know without judgment, or honestly some of the greatest blessings I could have possibly asked for. He was probably the first person in my life to really do this, him and my grandma. They both would let me be the way that I am, and if I had questions, they would always explain the answers to them, and they would never judge me for asking questions about life or trying to understand things. And so I think thanks to their presence, it really changed the course of my life. I wouldn't be who I am today without them. But I'm getting off topic. If you have a tendency to get off topic easily, you're probably neurodivergent. If you have trouble multitasking, you're probably neurodivergent. If you have ever been told by someone that you're not good at reading the room, you're probably neurodivergent. If you ever feel like you're miscommunicating no matter what you say, even though you're really trying your best not to miscommunicate, and you're using more words to over-explain and overshare, you're probably neurodivergent. And I know that these are a lot of generalizations. Like I said, it's not going to be true all the time, but I hope that this gives you enough to start questioning, hey, maybe my experience isn't the default one that most people experience. If you experience noise and can't filter out anything ever, you're almost guaranteed to be neurodivergent. If you're excellent at filtering things out, you're probably neurotypical. If you struggle a lot in sports and you were never good at sports and never good at team sports in particular, this is a big one, you are more likely to be neurodivergent for many reasons. Motor skills are really, really tough for people who are neurodivergent unless you start to create habits in your life that are able to help improve those areas of the brain. I was very blessed with a family who valued athletic exercise and athletic performance, so from a very young age I was weight training, like literally since birth pretty much. But not everyone else has that experience, and autistic people very frequently struggle with team sports and anything that involves coordination. If you feel like you have bad depth perception, it might not just be your vision. I thought it was my vision for the longest time. No, it wasn't. Now my depth perception is improving as I'm finding solutions to rewire parts of my brain and improve things. It was never my vision, it was the autism. If you feel like when you talk to your friends, you start on one topic and then you go over 25,000 other topics and then somehow it loops back to the original topic, you're probably neurodivergent. If you don't like small talk at all, you can't stand it, you're probably neurodivergent. If you really don't understand why people need you to say good morning or goodbye or hello when you walk into a room, if you don't feel the need to do that, you're probably neurodivergent. If you have always felt like an observer of people more than being a person yourself, you might be neurodivergent. This one probably sounds crazy if you haven't experienced it. It's sort of like feeling like an outsider in a lot of ways, but almost like you're trying to figure out what is the right way to be a human being. Like you're trying to apply logic to it. Most people don't really need to go through this logical thinking of how should I do this? Like, they just have a default framework that they subconsciously operate off of and they don't question it. So if you ask a lot of questions, you're more likely to be neurodivergent. Of course, there are neurotypicals who ask questions as well, but I mean consistently asking questions about absolutely everything. If you have several topics that you just can't stop focusing on and you feel obsessed, like there's nothing in the entire world that would make you happier than spending 8 hours doing this one thing, then you're probably neurodivergent. Even if this thing changes from 1 month to the next, that's still a neurodivergent sign. Neurotypical people, you can think of neurotypical people as having a special interest in people. Special interest in people, people's drama, and emotional discussions without necessarily looking for solutions. So if you're very solutions oriented and you don't understand why people complain if they don't have a solution in mind, you're probably neurodivergent. It's not 100% like I was mentioning, but it's a very strong sign. If you feel like you're misunderstood very often, you're probably neurodivergent. And if you remember being bullied a lot in school for doing things that people thought were different, you're probably neurodivergent. If you fit in very easily or were part of the popular crowd in childhood and school, you're probably neurotypical. Even if you weren't part of the popular crowd, if you immediately fit in with one group or another without doing any additional effort, that is highly likely neurotypical. I say highly likely because it is possible that you grew up in an environment with people who were like you, but in school probably not everyone was like you if you're neurodivergent. If you felt like you couldn't always connect with people in easy ways without developing an algorithm behind it of some sort, then you're probably neurodivergent. If you feel like you can connect with people when they share your interests, but that it's difficult to connect with them on levels when they don't share your interests, you're probably neurodivergent. This one is not exclusive. It is possible for someone who's neurodivergent to get very good at connecting with people by learning specific techniques and algorithms and thinking about it logically, but I mean from default. So all of these questions, think of this as me asking from default, were you good at this or not? From birth, were you able to walk up to people, make eye contact with them, socialize with them, and connect with them in some way? Or did you have to learn that? Did you have to learn that and think about it consciously? That's probably the biggest difference between neurotypical people and neurodivergent people, is that neurodivergent people have to learn this stuff consciously. We feel like we need an instruction manual for how to do things that other people simply take for granted. Unfortunately, as of yet, I have not found an instruction manual. If anyone listening knows of an instruction manual for how to life, that would be great. But, who knows? Maybe I'll write it someday. We'll see. If you feel like when you are talking to someone that it's impossible for you not to overshare, you're probably neurodivergent. If you either were or are unaware of the game of social interaction where people are trying to gain power over each other by pretending to be better than each other, you're probably neurodivergent if you're unaware of that. If this is news to you, well, congratulations. You've just learned that there's a game being played, a game that is very common in many social interactions, especially in the workforce. If this is the first time that you're hearing of this, both I'm sorry and you're neurodivergent and should probably get tested for it. If you are not able to look at someone else's face and know kind of what they're thinking or what they're feeling from those patterns, you're probably neurodivergent. Unless you've studied it consciously, of course. If you've studied, eyebrows up means surprise. Half smile, like one side higher than the other, means contempt. If you've studied all this consciously and that's how you get through social interactions, you're probably neurodivergent. If you haven't studied this and you think it's crazy that someone would ever even need to study this, you're probably neurotypical. If you tend to talk a lot, this could go either way. If you tend to talk a lot, depends what you're talking about. If you want to provide every single detail to have an exact account of what happened or how it felt and include every single detail, then you're probably neurodivergent. If you talk a lot because you like to talk, it could go either way. Some other things that can be linked to neurodivergent are in no particular order: seizures, sleep terrors, sleeping issues of any kind, insomnia, any sleep issues. There's a huge prevalence in the neurodivergent community. So if you're a great sleeper and have never in your entire life had any sleep issues, less likely to be neurodivergent. If you feel the need to question everything, more likely to be neurodivergent. If you most of the time just believe people from whatever they're saying and you trust everyone with everything, you're more likely to be neurodivergent. Neurodivergent people are known for being naive, not because we want to be, but because our default instinctive reaction is to believe people when they say something and take them literally. It's not that we want to take them literally, it's just that we don't really have a choice because there is an additional layer of processing that needs to happen before we are able to consciously question it. If you really love bright colors, things that sparkle, things that are lined up in a row, like having books stacked together in a particular way, you are probably neurodivergent. That last bit about particular way could be more OCD. OCD is still under the umbrella of neurodivergent. And I think that's something that's important to be stated. OCD is not like you would think. It's not, I have to keep every square inch of this room clean at this exact point in time. No, it's not like that. It's more like you have a bunch of little micro routines that you have to do either to improve sensory issues or because it just feels like the right way to do it. And when you don't do it that way, it feels wrong. Wrong meaning like uncomfortable with how it's being done. So if you're more resistant to change, you're more likely to be neurodivergent. This is not mutually exclusive. There are also neurodivergent people who are very good at going with the flow, but typically this is a learned behavior in neurodivergence. Are you noticing a pattern here? So many traits can overlap between people who are neurodivergent and are neurotypical. But in neurodivergence, these are traits that are consciously selected and consciously learned, whereas in neurotypicals, it's mostly a default, unchallenged, subconscious framework from birth that most people probably have never even considered in their life. If you have to think about making eye contact with your manager for 4 seconds on and 2 seconds off, the ideal NT social algorithm, then you're neurodivergent. If you're neurodivergent and you've never heard of this ideal algorithm, well, congrats. I wasn't aware of it until pretty recently either. So, enjoy the disguise of being neurotypical, or don't enjoy it, whatever. Anyways, if you kind of like chaos, not in like a stressful way, but you kind of like being surrounded by things or being like sitting in a corner, that's a very neurodivergent thing. If you like the pressure of the walls against your body when you're sitting on them, that's neurodivergence. If you really like deep pressure in general, but you don't particularly like light touches, you're probably neurodivergent. If you experience joint pains, more likely to be neurodivergent. If you make random sounds and you don't even know why, sounds like anything like that. Any random sounds and you feel compelled to do it, not doing it to make fun of something or to laugh at something, but you feel like you have to do it in that moment, then you're very, very likely to be neurodivergent. It's a form of vocal stimming. Most people don't realize that vocal stimming exists. To start, vocal stimming is a way of regulation of your environment and your emotional state, and if repressed, it can cause issues with emotional regulation in neurodivergent people. And if you feel like you have to speak every detail of every situation in order to somehow preserve its truth, and you feel like you have a very strong sense of justice about all the wrongs and the rights that are happening in this world, you're probably neurodivergent. Neurodivergent people tend to feel very strongly about morality. It is my way or the highway is a very real thing in the neurodivergent world. Ironically, me using that phrase is a neurotypical phrase. But I'm pretty sure most of you know what that means by now, if you're listening to this podcast. And yeah, that's a pretty comprehensive list of everything I can think of off the top of my head for signs you might be neurodivergent. If you're surprised by this very long list, then maybe consider getting tested. And remember, don't treat yourself any differently, because ultimately a diagnosis is incredibly helpful. When you know your own vulnerabilities and your own struggles, you're not bound by them in the ways that you were before. In fact, it leads you a greater power not only to love yourself, but to find solutions that actually work for you instead of listening to people who are coming up with solutions for someone who's wired differently than you, solutions that inherently won't work for you. So a diagnosis is nothing to be scared of. It is not something that you're going to be stigmatized for. Either you're going to be stigmatized or you're not going to be stigmatized, and a diagnosis is not going to change that. So I encourage you to really ask yourself, what are my habits? Are these habits consciously selected, or are these habits based on a subconscious framework? I think that's a good question for everyone to ask, whether you're neurodivergent or neurotypical. And I think there's great power in knowing yourself, knowing your weaknesses, knowing your vulnerabilities, knowing your strengths, and admitting that you have struggles. Because ultimately, everyone has struggles of some kind, whether you're neurodivergent or neurotypical. And there's no shame in being vocal about them, and being aware of them, and being willing to work with them. That's really all you can do. Thanks so much for listening.